Hansel and Gretel is not just a bedtime story. In 1315, as hunger swept across Europe, children were abandoned, and some were never seen again. Evidence from the Great Famine shows families pushed to the unthinkable, and whispers tell of a woman in the woods who fed on the lost. The truth Disney buried is far darker. What really happened to the vanished children? Rain fell for months without end, soaking the earth and drowning hope in every village from France to the Baltic. By midsummer of 1315, fields that should have been golden with wheat were seas of black mud. Seed grains stored from the last harvest rotted in piles, useless. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the stench of decay and wet straw. Nothing could dry. Grain prices soared. Wheat cost 3 times what it had the year before. Salt, needed to preserve what little meat remained, was so rare that only the wealthiest could afford it. For most, there was nothing but hunger. Cattle and horses, the engines of medieval farming, began to die from murrain. It meant any disease that swept through herds like a curse. Without beasts to plow or haul, even the strongest farmers found their strength wasted. People ate bark, roots, and whatever wild plants they could find, but these offered little relief. In every direction, the famine spread. Entire villages emptied almost overnight. Some families wandered for days, searching for food that did not exist. Desperation defined the roads and the fields. Chroniclers wrote of violent fights over scraps of spoiled bread. In Bristol, the city records describe the living barely able to bury their dead. In the countryside, old men and women sometimes refused food so that children might have a chance. But the hunger was relentless, pressing in on every household, turning neighbors into rivals, and making survival the only law that mattered. The Great Famine was not a single tragedy, but a force that touched every life, leaving no one untouched. Inside those dark, mud-splattered cottages, hunger twisted every thought. Parents lay awake, listening to the slow breathing of their children, wondering how many more nights they could endure. Arguments broke out in whispers behind thin walls and shuttered windows, debates not about what to eat, but who would eat at all. Some elders, remembering other hard winters, pushed their bowls away. They insisted the youngest should eat instead, their own hands trembling from weakness. In village records from these years, there are stories of grandparents refusing even the smallest crust, letting themselves fade so a grandchild might live another day. But for many, the math of survival became even colder. The food left on the table could not stretch for everyone. Mothers and fathers, desperate and ashamed, weighed impossible choices. Chroniclers wrote of parents staring at their children, then at the empty cupboard, and finally at the door, calculating whether letting them go into the woods was a mercy or a sentence. Some believed a child might find wild berries, a stranger's kindness, or simply a quicker end than starvation at home. Others hoped the forest itself would decide, sparing them from the guilt of choosing. No one spoke of it openly. The silence in those houses was thick with dread. The bonds that once held families together strained and snapped under the weight of famine. Abandonment was not the act of monsters, but of parents who had run out of hope. In the records that survived, the names of the lost children are rarely written. Only the empty spaces remain. Children slipped quietly from memory as the famine dragged on. Some left behind only a flattened patch in the straw, or a single shoe pressed deep in the mud. Parish registers from these years grew sparse, names of the young missing from baptism rolls, their endings unrecorded. In the towns, neighbors whispered about empty beds and vanished voices. In the countryside, the silence at dawn was broken only by crows circling fields where no one played. No one dared count the true number lost. Chroniclers wrote of thousands, whole generations swallowed by the woods. In some villages, so many children disappeared that the remaining elders spoke of a curse, as if the forest itself had grown hungry. The official records, when they mention children at all, speak in riddles. Gone to gather wood, absent since the last rain, lost to the green. No one returned to mark their graves. Parents sometimes scattered crumbs or pebbles behind in hope or in guilt, but the forest always found a way to erase their path. Birds picked the ground clean, leaving no trace of the route home. The story spread from house to house, a warning told in low voices. If a child vanished, they were not alone. The scale of absence became its own terror, a wound carved into every family. Some believed that something waited among the trees, collecting the lost. Others tried not to imagine what became of those who never returned. The woods grew darker with every missing child. Where had they all gone? In the shadow of vanished children, stories began to take on a life of their own. Among the tangled roots and dripping branches, villagers whispered about a woman who lived alone, deeper in the forest than any dared go. She was neither neighbor nor kin, an outcast marked by suspicion and fear. Some said she survived the famine while others wasted away. Her secret, they claimed, was darker than hunger. The German word Kindlefresser, child eater, found its way into these tales. Old woodcuts showed creatures with sacks of squirming children, mouths wide enough to swallow a head whole. But in the famine years, the monster was no longer a beast. She wore a human face, lined and hungry, watching for the desperate and the lost. For children, the forest was both punishment and promise. Hunger twisted their senses. When the pain grew sharp enough, even the impossible seemed real. They imagined a house that smelled of roasted nuts, walls with the sheen of sugar, windows that glittered like spun candy. The legend of the land of Cockaigne, where rivers ran with milk and roofs dripped with honey, bled into the story. Starving minds conjured feasts from thin air, and the fantasy of an edible house became more than a dream. It became a trap. The outcast woman's home, hidden among the trees, was said to offer everything a starving child could want. But the closer you came, the more wrong it felt. Sweetness masking something rotten underneath. Children who crossed her threshold rarely returned. In the minds of those left behind, the line between myth and memory began to blur. The witch was not just a story. She was the shape hunger took in the dark. Gretel's hands shook as the witch's grip pressed her toward the oven's gaping mouth. Smoke curled from the coals, thick and choking. The old woman's voice scraped at her ears, promising warmth, promising food, promising death. In that final moment, Gretel acted. One shove, desperate and wild, sent the witch tumbling into the flames. The scream vanished beneath the roar of fire. For centuries, fire meant more than punishment. It was how villages purged disease, how they erased what could not be forgiven. The witch's end was not just vengeance. It was a warning burned into memory. In the ashes, the truth finally surfaced. She was no demon, but a human predator, born of famine and exile. Children vanished because hunger made monsters of the desperate. Some were abandoned. Some were hunted. All were lost to the shadows beneath the trees. The Brothers Grimm stepped into a world still haunted by famine, gathering stories that had survived in whispers and warnings. Yet when their manuscript reached print in 1812, the darkest truths were already fading. The earliest versions of Hansel and Gretel spoke openly of hunger, of abandonment, and of the threat of being eaten. But as the Grimms revised their tales for a growing audience of families, something changed. Scenes of cannibalism vanished. The witch became a monster, not a mirror. The children's return was rewritten as a joyful reunion, the pain of loss replaced by a promise of safety. In the margins, the Grimms erased the bones, the hunger, the real fate of the lost. What survived was a bedtime story, stripped of the horror that gave it meaning. The warning became a wish, and the truth, like so many children, disappeared into the woods. Folktales still soften history, but hunger remains a weapon in modern conflicts, used to drive people to desperate acts. The line between myth and warning blurs when survival is at stake. What we choose to forget has a way of finding its way back. Share your thoughts below.